Well, welcome to this episode 3 of A Fire in the Night, our exploration with Dr. Stephen Reid from Truett Seminary, our exploration of the Psalms in the weekly lectionary. And we have a treat for us today because we have Psalm 78, which, as Dr. Reid informed me, is the second longest psalm in the Psalter. In today's worship, you got a little bit of it. In fact, you got just a tiny, tiny bit of it. And we're going to talk about a little bit more of that psalm. But first, we're going to read it for you. Dr. Reid, anything we need to know before we kick off reading this psalm?
Because we tend to be impatient, I invite people to get comfortable so that they can listen attentively.
And we are reading part 1. In the Book of Common Prayer, this psalm is divided into part 1 and part 2. Because of
prayer.
Yeah, morning and evening prayer. That's why you pray part 1 in the morning. The Psalter is gracious to you in that regard, that it doesn't expect you to pray it all in one go. And then you pray part 2 for evening prayer. So let me share the screen and we'll pray it together. And this, by the way, is from the Book of Common Prayer website, which I believe it looks fairly nice and professional, but I think it's a hobby of someone, a servant in the church. Okay. Psalm 78. Hear my teaching, O my people. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth.
I will open my mouth in a parable. I will declare the mysteries of ancient times.
That which we have heard and known, and what our forefathers have told us, we will not hide from their children.
We will recount to generations to come the praiseworthy deeds and the power of the Lord and the wonderful works he has done.
He gave his decrees to Jacob and established a law for Israel, which he commanded them to teach their children.
That the generations to come might know, and the children yet unborn, that they in their might tell it to their children.
So that they might put their trust in God and not forget the deeds of God, but keep his commandments.
That the
Or verse 8.
And not be like their forefathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation whose heart was not steadfast and whose spirit was not faithful to God.
The people of Ephraim, armed with the bow, turned back in the day of battle.
They did not keep the covenant of God and refused to walk in his law.
They forgot what he had done and the wonders he had shown them.
He worked marvels in the sight of their forefathers in the land of Egypt, in the field of Zoan.
He split open the sea and let them pass through. He made the waters stand up like walls.
He led them with a cloud by day, and all the night through with a glow of fire.
He split the hard rocks in the wilderness and gave them drink as from the great deep.
He brought streams out of the cliff, and waters gushed out like rivers.
But they went on sinning against him, rebelling in the desert against the Most High.
They tested God in their hearts, demanding food for their craving.
They railed against God and said, "Can God set a table in the wilderness?"
True, he struck the rock, and waters gushed out, and gullies overflowed. But is he able to give bread or to provide meat for his people?
When the Lord heard this, he was full of wrath. A fire was kindled against Jacob, and his anger mounted against Israel.
for they had no faith in God, nor did they put their trust in his saving power.
So he commanded the clouds above and opened the doors of heaven.
He rained down manna upon them to eat and gave them grain from heaven.
So mortals ate the bread of angels. He provided for them food enough.
He caused the east wind to blow in heaven and led out the south wind by his might.
He rained down flesh upon them like dust and winged birds like the sand of the sea.
He let it fall in the midst of their camp and round about their dwellings.
So they ate and were well filled, for he gave them what they craved.
But they did not stop their craving, though the food was still in their mouths.
So God's anger mounted against them. He slew their strongest men and laid low the youth of Israel.
In spite of all of this, they went on sinning and had no faith in his wonderful works.
So he brought their days to an end like a breath, and their years in sudden terror.
Whenever he slew them, they would seek him and repent and diligently search for God.
They would remember that God was their rock and the Most High God their Redeemer.
But they flattered him with their mouth and lied to him with their tongues.
Their heart was not steadfast toward him, and they were not faithful to his covenant.
But he was so merciful that he forgave their sins and did not destroy them. Many times he held back his anger and did not permit his wrath to be roused.
For he remembered that they were but flesh, a breath that goes forth and does not return. Continues in a similar vein for part 2, right?
Yes. Yes, it does.
Well, Dr. Reid, talk us through, what is this psalm doing?
Well, last week we were in Psalm 105, which is part of Book 4, and now we're in Book 3. Book 3 begins with Psalm 73 and is one of the Psalms of Asaph.
Okay.
The Psalms of Asaph begin in Psalm 50, but pick up again in 73 and go through 83. Now, many folks don't remember who Asaph was, and so I want to do a little bit of history. And here we really depend on the chronicler. When David brings the ark into Jerusalem, recounted in 1 Chronicles 16, he sets Asaph as the sort of chief worship leader. And he then asks Asaph, well, ask is probably not the right verb. He instructs.
King, you ask anyone anything when you're king, right?
Yeah. He instructs Asaph to come up with a song of thanksgiving. One of the interesting things about this song of thanksgiving is that it includes portions of various psalms, such as 105, which we talked about some last week, and Psalm 96. But we start to see the emergence of a group of Levitical priests who are in charge of worship and music in the temple. We think that these are probably the folks who will become the Asaphites. And the Psalms of Asaph come from this sort of Levitical tradition. Now, Psalm 78, as well as being a psalm of Asaph, is also a historical psalm. We talked about this some last week, but let's just review. Um, Historical psalms are psalms that basically recount in significant detail, and as you already heard, uh, Psalm 78 goes on for a long time, 72 verses of history. And so Psalm 78 is the first of the historical psalms that we read if we're reading in order.
Mm.
The historical psalms are 78, 105, 106, 135, and 136. So this is sort of the introduction to the historical psalms. When we think of the historical psalms, they refer to just sort of bits and pieces of the history. It's almost as though there's a curriculum for the history that these, let's think of them as choir leaders. And in this history, the so-called plague narratives are going to recur pretty often. And as you'll notice, when we looked at most of the Psalms this season, there have been references to the plague narratives. I don't want to digress, but I do want to just sort of unpack what's going on with the plague narratives. The plague narratives, we call them the plague narratives. The Hebrew term is ot, or sign, partly because these events are meant to be a sign to the people, to the Hebrews, but also to the Egyptians. There's an interesting passage in Exodus that says, we do these things so that the Egyptians might know that the Lord is the Lord. And so the function of these stories is to provide a testament to God's power and God's glory.
Steve, these 10 signs, locusts, flies, hail. You remember Charlton Heston here.
Yes.
It's interesting how the term sign is similar to what's used for miracles often in John's gospel. That Jesus, he doesn't do miracles as such, they're signs. They're supposed to tell you something. And these plagues are telling you something.
That's right. Neal is really gesturing to where this is going. You can see in the Exodus material reused in the Psalms that's on its way to what you're going to get in John. The purpose of history is not for its own sake, and in some sense not even for human sake. It is to testify to the nature of God. And so in the historical Psalms, if you get it, it's not that you understand history, but you recognize the miraculous and astonishing nature of God. A second part of the curriculum is the story of the people complaining. It's interesting that the complaining of people is a key part of the salvation history story.
We can't relate to that at all.
We can't, no, because the people in our congregations are always really nice and not like the people in these stories. But I think one of the things that is going on here is in much of human history, we think it's about humans. And for the biblical writers, they knew that the prime actor in history was God. And so they crafted a storyline that way. And so the wilderness wanderings and the murmuring stories, one of the reasons I like the term murmuring stories is in Hebrew, the word, it says the people murmured. And in Hebrew, this is the verb marar. And you can almost hear the undertone of muttering in the way they talk about this. And so the story of the people complaining at Massa, which means to test, and Meribah, where they strike the rock and water comes out, shows up pretty consistently in the historical Psalms. And I think the issue we talked about some last week, and we'll talk about again this week. If you get it, you recognize the miraculous nature of God, and you have a sense of astonishment
Mm-hmm.
and wonder.
Mm-hmm.
The language here also is the word for wonderful.
Mm.
The structure of the passage is pretty straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
1 through 11 gives you a basic introduction. 12 through 39 is a first recital. And then, just in case you didn't get it the first time, they have a second recital, which is going to be 40 through 72. I like to think of the second recital as when you're watching a number of serialized television shows, they'll say previously seen,
Mm-hmm.
and then they'll rehearse. And that's some of what you get in Psalm 78. Psalm 78 begins in a pretty typical way for a psalm, a call to hear. But then in verse 2, you get an interesting passage.
I wanted to ask you about this.
Yeah, I will open my mouth in a parable. One of the things that Psalm 78 really sort of makes clear is that the nature of history is itself mysterious.
Yes.
And declare the mysteries of ancient times. One of the things that we heard last week when we looked at the passage is the contingency of human life.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that we as humans do is we try to make sense of history and life because we know that it is fleeting.
Mm-hmm.
And so that means that we receive history as a mystery that we need to unfold.
So say we're always interpreting, right?
We're always interpreting.
Things in the past happened, yes, but we don't just sort of receive it all as a clear package, right?
That's right.
We have to think and weigh what is really important, what's not important, and that's right.
That's right. Interpretation always has a context, and that context is usually contested.
Yeah.
The language that we get here is a language of contest. The word proverb is the Hebrew word mashal, which as a noun means proverb, but mashal as a verb means to rule. And one of the things that we'll recognize, and the next piece is in that same verse, it talks about a riddle, the riddle of time or the riddle of history. The translation we have in the Book of Common Prayer talks about mystery, is the way they're rendering riddle. But one of the things to keep in mind is in antiquity, proverbs and riddles were one of the ways you could tell whether someone had discernment and power. In 1 Kings 10, the Queen of Sheba tests Solomon by riddles and proverbs. So that's setting this up. But also, you get the importance of reciting this. Notice in verse 3, that which we have heard and known, what our forefathers, uh, have told us, we will not hide from their children. Now here, the passage in 3 is meant to make us think about the instructions in Deuteronomy. Remember the instructions in Deuteronomy 6? Make sure to tell your children.
Write it on your forehead.
Write it on your forehead. And so the point of history is to help orient not only the adults, but the whole family, including the children, into the generations. You have an interesting rhetorical strategy in these first 7 verses. The writer really picks up sets of triplets. And let me just sort of read through some of these. And I'm going to read through these quickly, but you'll be able to watch the tape and pick them up. For instance, the one set of triplets are teaching, parable, dark saying, or riddle. Their children, unborn children, children's children. The decree in Jacob, the law in Israel, and the command. The glorious deeds of the Lord, the wonders God has done, the works of God. The writer does this history in such intricate poetry that you have these triplets that bind together the sort of core concepts of the history. And even though the final triplet in verse 8 is not included in the lectionary, nonetheless, it does do something interesting because it talks about, it describes the faithlessness of the people, for a rebellious generation, not steadfast of heart, and not faithful in spirit.
It's really working the point, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. So you get the rule of threes really coming through in these first 8 verses. Now, the speaker provides the witness and the hearing. But here I want to just sort of take a moment and talk about the role of liturgy, spiritual formation, because I think that's really what we're talking about here. The speaker of the Psalms wants to provide a witness of what is known, heard, and rooted in the familial traditions. It's important for families to know where we come from as a religious community, because that enables the family to figure out what's going on in the present and anticipate a future. The psalm is about history, the combination, and one of the things, if we had more time, we'd tease out more. But as you read this, notice the number of times you get remembering and forgetting. And that both things become important elements here. Because for the psalmist here, the biggest indictment is the inability to remember, which stated positively is the persistence of our forgetting is our biggest problem. Now, we can take a very household example of this. How many times have you forgotten where to put a particular pan, or forgotten where a book goes?
I forget my keys and wallet all the time.
Yeah. So
a liturgy
forgetting
at my house, cell phone, keys, wallet when I leave the house, a liturgy of remembering.
A liturgy of remembering, that's right. And so the psalmist wants to set up that in this first recital.
That seems like a huge human problem, right? That the things the values, the things that are really important, we keep forgetting these. And it's connected, I think, with our death. We are fleeting breath. Because we don't live forever, we can't remember much.
Yeah. And because we can't remember what much, we often can't live well.
No, that's right.
Um, Now, in the first recital, 12 through 39, uh, we come back to manna. And it's interesting that manna shows up in the Gospel of John, chapter 3:61. They're going to echo Psalm 78. And notice they're going to talk about this as bread from heaven.
Yeah.
I think this is a particularly rich metaphor for Eucharistic traditions. Because it really anticipates what takes place in the Eucharist.
Steve,
Yes, go ahead.
the hunger here is more than just food, right?
Yes,
It's craving. It's
craving. Yeah,
something kind of profound. In the same way, in John's Gospel, bread is more than just bread.
yeah, and one of the things that becomes important as we read this text is to remind folks to be mindful of food.
Mm-hmm.
Elizabeth Ellen F. Davis has a book on agriculture and the Bible. She's an Anglican priest teaching at Duke Divinity School.
Mm-hmm.
And she wants to lift up the importance of agriculture for the community that really recorded the Bible. And one of my students said this week, she indicates that what you eat says something about who you are theologically. Indeed, I think that's what Psalm 78 is about. The manna really does have a reflection on who we are, and eating as a gift from God. She contrasts the recognizing God as the giver of food from perceiving ourselves as the manufacturer of food. So the manna stuff becomes a pretty key element in the historical Psalms because of what it's going to do theologically.
It's a sign of dependence, right? The people come from Egypt where they're laboring for food.
Mm-hmm.
And here they can't actually labor for this food.
Yes.
It's just given, and they just have to receive it.
And part of the challenge here is one needs to recognize that in some sense the wilderness does not end. The story of Massa and Meribah and God providing food becomes a pretty revolutionary story. Mm-hmm. Because when they move into the land, there's always the temptation of saying, well, this is my land, I planted this, I watered it, and this is my produce. And the wilderness stories say, no, this is still an extension of the manna that God provided in the wilderness. So the wilderness helps really be like a lens to see the present. One of the things that, to use an example, we're going to send our kids off to Episcopal camp, to church camp. And part of the reason for that is things happen at church camp that help deepen spiritual formation, and that children and young adults will then carry with them the rest of their life. And so the wilderness functions somewhat like camp. It is a spiritual formation time. And the challenge is to really learn from that experience.
And to not, like you said, not forget.
and not
That in the
forget.
present moment, not forget what happened in the wilderness when you were hungry, that God provided.
That's right.
Not just when you were hungry, when you were complaining and craving.
Yes.
uh,
And because we all know from family life, it's easy to be copacetic when no one's really pressing you.
yes.
Um, but when the child is just sort of tugging and wanting something, that's sometimes the hardest time to give it.
It's a very true insight there.
So this story just sort of reminds us of those things. In verses 15 and 16, we go back to the story of Massa and Meribah. And I want to accent again. Massa is testing.
Mm.
And to use a young child, children will test you.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes just to see how you'll do.
That's right.
And in the midst of that, Moses is told to strike the rock, and water comes out. And the waters of Meribah provides an ongoing source of relief. But in verse 21 through 31, they refer to the first manna story, and then they come back to the second manna story. And this is where we pick up the manna and the quail.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the first time, God was pretty understanding, but by the time you get to the Numbers account, God's not in a good mood about this.
Bread wasn't enough.
Bread wasn't enough.
It needed to be burgers.
Yeah. They said, well, where's the brisket?
That's right.
Uh,
There's nothing to go between this sandwich.
yeah. I mean, we got biscuits, but no meat. What? How could this be? And the story has some great humor. God gives them food, and the verb I think is so great. Meat just rains down. It almost reminds you. I think it's a Disney film that talks about raining meatballs.
Cloudy with the Chance of Meatballs or something?
Yeah, cloudy with a chance of meatballs.
Yeah.
And that's really sort of the image you have going on here. It comes down, and God feeds them until they don't want anymore, and it's in their nostrils.
Yeah. You want food? I'll give you food.
I'll give you food. Yeah. So it's a great story, but it also talks about gives you a sense of God's frustration and anger. Now the section ends in 39 with a powerful passage that God held back anger and did not permit wrath to be roused. And one writer was so struck by this, he named his dissertation, he titled his dissertation on verse 39. For God remembered that they were but flesh, a breath that goes and does not return. I think the Book of Common Prayer does a good job of stopping. This is a great place to stop.
Yeah.
Because it recognizes that history is important. It is important not only to human beings, but important to God. But God still recognizes the fragility of human life. And notice that here, the subject of remembering is God.
Yes. We have to remember something, but we depend on God remembering some things too, right?
That's right. When not long after my mom was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, I was talking with my friend Andy, and I said, Andy, one of the things that's hard is a child of someone struggling with dementia or Alzheimer's is they don't remember who you are. And Andy, being a good friend, said, but God remembers on their behalf.
Oh, wow.
And so in 39, God is remembering on behalf of the frail creatures who are us, who are a breath that goes forth and doesn't return.
Put this in connection with the incarnation and death and resurrection of Jesus, that this memory is personal, right? That it's enacted by God. It's that God is this distant judge, and yet the same one who remembers personally, in a sense, the fleetingness of our lives.
Yes. And because God recognizes that, it pushes us to recognize the fleetingness, but also the generosity of God. God's activity on our behalf is not because we're nice people, or because we're strong people or virtuous people, but it is an expression of God's graciousness.
And he doesn't, so sometimes he gives us things like manna and bread that we didn't deserve. And then he also doesn't give us things that we do deserve, right?
That's right.
That's what this psalm is highlighting. That the people didn't deserve the bread, but they got it. They do deserve wrath, but they don't get it because God remembers his mercy.
Yeah. And in the memory of God is where things, that's where things thrive. In the second recital, particularly verses 44 through 51, they review the signs of divine redemption from bondage. These are the references to the so-called plague narratives in Exodus 7 through 12. There's an interesting passage here that says, like the heights of heaven, which is amended in the Hebrew. Here, for those of you who are listening at home, if you need to go to the refrigerator to get something to drink, I'm just gonna nerd out for a minute here.
What verse is this, Steve? So I can.
This is. Oh, let's see if I can find it in English. This is the heights. I think this is about verse. Let's see here. See the enemy's backsides. Yes, verse 69. Yes. God built a sanctuary like the heights of heaven. The heights of heaven is the Hebrew ra'am, but some Hebrew manuscripts repointed that as ra'am, which means a wild bull. The Septuagint read ra'am as wild bull and turned it into a rhinoceros.
So he built his sanctuary like a rhinoceros?
Like a rhinoceros. And then the Septuagint takes the Greek monokeros.
Okay.
And then turns it into a unicorn.
Yes. So I'm curious, in the Coverdale Psalter, the old Psalter, I'm going to look that up because it may be the same. You never know what you'll find.
Yeah. An early Christian writer, Cestius, in his work Indica, described this type of creature, and and quoting him, he says, the Septuagint uses the image of the unicorn as a symbol for divine or God-given strength and power.
Well, you know, one of my favorite verses in the whole of the Psalter is verse 66. And at seminary, we would have evensong where we would chant the Psalter. And I was always loved. It seemed like this 78 came up all the time, at least.
Yeah.
And chanting, he struck his enemies on the
Backside. Yeah.
put them to,
Perpetual shame.
yeah. The God opened up a can, right? It's the vernacular.
Yeah.
It's pretty great.
The bad news doesn't stop, though. The psalm concludes with a replacement theology. The priests and the people reject Shiloh, and by rejecting Shiloh, reject God. And the same theme occurs in Jeremiah 7:12-14 and 26:6. The rejecting of Shiloh parallels the rejection of the tents of Joseph. But the rejection of Shiloh and the tents of Joseph is offset by God's sense of election, because God pulls from the inheritance of Joseph and Ephraim and picks David in verses 70 and 72. But this is a stylized David, and the New Testament picks up and manages this David and embraces him as a man after God's own heart, Acts 13:22.
Well, and
David replaces.
Sorry, go ahead, Steve.
David replaces the other ancestors. And in early Christianity, David is going to become really our first notions of what Jesus is going to be like.
And he's a shepherd, right?
Yeah, he's a shepherd.
The shepherd of the people he's a shepherd of ewes, and then he's a shepherd over the people. And Jesus, of course, is the great shepherd.
Yes. And so you'll get folks like Bonhoeffer who are going to have a pretty Christological reading of the Psalms. And most every place where you see David, they're going to invite you to see Christ. And so the rejected Joseph is replaced by an heir who is in fact David, who then points to Christ. The rejected Shiloh gives way to Zion, which is the place where God will lead. Now, I just want to, yes, go ahead.
Well, it seems like it's doing something we saw in part one, where God provides, the people forget and turn away. Then God provides again, and God remembers. So he gives them water, then he gives them bread, and then he gives them bread and meat. And then they turn again, and he doesn't destroy them because he remembers that they are but flesh. They turn away. God rejects them, but then chooses David as a means. So it's just back and forth.
Back and forth. And part of what we should recognize in history is the back and forth. And this provides an interesting alternative to thinking about history as ever improving and progressing. It's a movement back and forth, and you can see God's handiwork in each part of the storyline. Now, in the Revised Common Lectionary, Psalm 78 shows up twice, and both in year A. It's interesting, the Psalms we picked are all sort of year A Psalms. They don't occur in multiple years. Other Psalms do occur in multiple years, but not the batch we've had so far. And the Revised Common Lectionary always cuts the Psalm up.
Big time in this case.
Big time. And on the 19th Sunday after Pentecost, it's connected with Exodus 17. This is the testing. And on the 25th Sunday after Pentecost, it's paired with Joshua 24. This is the covenant renewal at Shechem. And that makes sense that you would have the rehearsal of history. And then after rehearsal of history, you have the call in Joshua, choose this day who you will serve, the gods of beyond the river, or the God who delivered you from Egypt and brought you in to this promised land. So our topic, our real movement, once again, is one of abiding astonishment, to use Brueggemann's phrase, recognition of the marvelous things God has done for us, recognition of our own fragility.
Not forgetting. And this is
not forgetting.
I mean, it seems like this is such an essential part of faith, of being a Christian. And there's something about the Psalms as poetry that are a helpful way not to forget. If you can sing about it, maybe you won't forget it this time, if you can put it into a song.
And this is one of the reasons why the liturgy becomes so important. Because most of us don't spend many hours in the liturgy. We spend much more time watching television, listening to radio, and consuming culture, which has often messages that are about forgetting or remembering different stuff. And so the liturgy becomes a sort of counter narrative, a counter poetry. And only through evensong, morning prayers, Eucharist, the church is able to, in some sense, offset the onslaught that you get from culture. And so that's one of the reasons why the lectionary and the liturgy becomes so important in the 21st century.
I think in terms COVID time, right? It which feels like a fog of forgetting, right? It seems new, and yet like this is something humans have done before, and everything seems the immediate seems so heightened. To remember that people have been in the wilderness, that they have forgotten, that they've sinned, that their lives were fleeting, and yet in the midst of this, again and again and again, God provides food and a shepherd. And in the New Testament, Jesus becomes both the shepherd to the sheep who are lost and the bread of heaven. And that, I mean, we need to be reminded of that always, but man, I feel like I need that now. Like the wilderness, God's going to provide. He's here. We just have to remember it.
Yes. Yeah, and I like your observation that God in Christ is both shepherd and manna. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Dr. Reid. It was a lot of fun. Next week, Psalm 19, a lovely psalm, and it's a shorter one, so we'll be able to read one in its entirety, and it will be a great time. So thank you so much.
And I think I heard that you're going to be a cantor next week.
There were rumors. Yes, I will chant Psalm 19. I didn't want to chant Psalm 78.
We appreciate that.
It was, yeah, that's right. I think by the end it would be more of a, what is the Hebrew word for murmur? That's right. All right. Well, thanks, Dr. Reid.
Okay. Thank you.